There is something profoundly unsettling about being truly seen. Not admired, not desired, not pursued, seen because when someone truly sees you, they don't just notice your strengths, they see the armor, they see the deflection. They see the carefully constructed independence that was never about freedom. It was about protection. And that is why the avoidant never forgets the empath who exposed them. You see, an avoidant is not someone who doesn't feel. They feel deeply. But feeling deeply once cost them something, so they learn to ration emotion, to intellectualize it, to step back the moment closeness began to feel real. Then the empath walks in. The empath doesn't push, doesn't force, doesn't demand. They simply notice. They notice the shift in tone, the micro withdrawals, the hesitation before intimacy. And instead of reacting with panic, they respond with presence. That presence is powerful because calm love is a mirror. And in that mirror, the avoidant sees the truth, not the image they curated, but the vulnerability underneath, the longing, the fear of not being enough, the silent hope that someone might stay without needing them to perform. That is terrifying, because when someone exposes the real you and still stays, your excuses collapse. You can no longer say, they don't understand me. You can no longer say, they're too needy. You can no longer say, I just haven't met the right person. You met them, and they saw you. The empath becomes unforgettable, not because they chased, but because they didn't. They didn't beg for reassurance. They didn't shrink themselves to be digestible. They didn't try to fix what wasn't theirs to fix. They stood in their worth. And here is the divine principle hidden in this dynamic. What exposes us also invites us to evolve. The empath is not sent into the avoidance life to save them. They are sent as a mirror, a reflection of emotional courage, of softness without weakness, of love without attachment to outcome. And when that empath finally walks away, not in anger, but in alignment, they leave something behind, silence. And in that silence, the avoidant hears their own heart. They remember the way that person made them feel safe and uncomfortable at the same time. Safe because they were accepted, uncomfortable because they were accountable. Growth always feels like loss before it feels like liberation. That is why the avoidant replays the memory. Not because they miss the drama, but because they miss the reflection of who they could have become. And if you are the empath in this story, understand this. Your job was never to stay long enough for someone to choose you. Your job was to remain whole while loving. Your power was never in convincing someone to open up. It was in showing them what openness looks like. And here is where transformation happens for both sides. For the avoidant, the memory becomes a crossroads. They either retreat deeper into comfort or they rise to meet the version of themselves they glimpsed in that mirror. For the empath, the lesson is sacred. Love does not require self-abandonment. Presence does not require pursuit. And walking away is not failure. It is faith. Because when you walk away from someone who cannot meet you, you are not losing them. You are choosing yourself, and that choice reverberates. It teaches the world how to love you. It teaches your heart that it is safe to demand depth. It teaches even the one who ran that connection is not something to fear. It is something to grow into. The mirror they feared was never you. It was the truth within them. And the reason they will never forget you is because once someone has seen their highest self reflected back at them, they can never again pretend they are unaware of it. So stand tall in your empathy, stand firm in your standards, and never apologize for being the mirror that awakens others. Some reflections are meant to be remembered, not reclaimed. Avoidants are not afraid of love. They are afraid of vulnerability and emotional exposure. On the surface, it can look like indifference. It can look like detachment, independence, even arrogance. They may say they don't want anything serious, that they value their space, that they don't like drama. But if you look closer, what you'll often find is not a lack of feeling, it's a fear of being emotionally seen, without armor. Love, in its purest form, requires openness. It requires someone to reveal their insecurities, their longings, their imperfections. It asks a person to say, this is who I am, without filters. This is what I need. This is what scares me. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that kind of exposure feels dangerous because vulnerability once felt unsafe. Somewhere in their past, expressing emotion may have been dismissed, punished, ignored, or met with inconsistency. Maybe they learned that needing someone led to disappointment. Maybe they discovered that depending on someone meant losing control. So they adapted, they became self-reliant, they built a life where independence was strength and emotional distance was stability. And that strategy worked until love showed up. The problem isn't connection itself. Avoidants often crave closeness just as deeply as anyone else. They want companionship, intimacy, and someone who understands them. But when closeness begins to deepen, when someone moves from casual interest into emotional significance, an alarm goes off internally. The alarm says, this matters, and if this matters, it can hurt. That's when you see the subtle withdrawal. They might start needing more space. They might focus on work. They might point out flaws in the relationship that never seemed to bother them before. It's not because their feelings disappeared. It's because their feelings intensified. Intensity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability means someone could see the parts they've kept hidden. The fear of rejection, the fear of inadequacy, the fear of not being able to sustain intimacy. Emotional exposure feels like standing in bright light after years of living in controlled shadows. To an avoidant, love feels manageable when it's slightly distant. It feels safer when there's ambiguity. As long as they are not fully known, they remain protected. But the moment someone starts understanding their patterns, noticing their defenses, gently calling out their walls, that's when discomfort arises. Because being seen removes the escape route of denial. If no one notices your defenses, you can pretend they aren't there. If no one asks you to go deeper, you can convince yourself that surface-level connection is enough. But when someone lovingly holds up a mirror and says, I see you, not just your strength, but your fear, that can feel overwhelming. It challenges their identity. Avoidants often pride themselves on being low maintenance, logical, composed. Vulnerability disrupts that self-image. It introduces uncertainty. It forces them to confront emotions they've learned to manage by minimizing. So they pull away. Not because they don't care, but because caring feels like exposure. And exposure feels like risk. The risk of being dependent. The risk of losing control. The risk of someone discovering that beneath their calm exterior is a human being who longs to be chosen, reassured, and held. Love threatens the structure they built to survive. And here's the paradox. The very thing they avoid is the thing they most deeply desire. They want intimacy without the fear, closeness without the risk, connection without the surrender. But real love doesn't work that way. It requires courage. The courage to let someone see you fully and stay anyway. For someone with avoidant tendencies, the journey is not about learning how to love others. It's about learning how to feel safe being vulnerable. It's about realizing that emotional exposure is not weakness, and that letting someone see their fears does not automatically lead to abandonment. Until that shift happens, love will continue to feel like a threat rather than a gift. Not because they lack the capacity for deep connection, but because opening their heart feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory without protection. The empath mirrors back the parts of them they have worked hard to suppress. There is something profoundly disarming about being around someone who sees beyond the sue. Phrase the empath has a quiet attentiveness. They notice tone shifts, body language, pauses between words. They sense what is said and what is avoided. And without trying to interrogate or expose, they naturally reflect what they perceive. For someone who has spent years mastering emotional concealment, that reflection can feel unsettling. Avoidants often build an identity around strength and composure. They pride themselves on being unaffected, rational, independent. They convince themselves that they don't need much, that they're just not that emotional, that deep conversations are unnecessary complications. But beneath that constructed calm are emotions that were never processed, sadness that was swallowed, fear that was minimized, longing that was denied. The empath does not attack these hidden layers. They simply stand present enough for them to rise. When the avoidant withdraws, the empath doesn't immediately react with anger. They gently say, I feel you pulling away. When the avoidant makes a joke to deflect vulnerability, the empath smiles but asks, what's really going on? When the avoidant claims they're fine, the empath's energy communicates, you don't have to pretend with me. And that is the mirror. Because suddenly the avoidant is faced with something they cannot easily control. Emotional truth. It's one thing to suppress feelings when no one notices. It's another thing entirely when someone calmly acknowledges them. The empath's presence makes it harder to maintain the illusion of emotional invulnerability. They don't accuse. They don't shame, but they reflect. You say you don't care, but your eyes say you do. You say you don't need anyone, but you light up when you're understood. You say it's not a big deal, but your silence feels heavy. This mirroring disrupts the avoidance coping mechanism. It challenges the narrative dub I've rehearsed for years. I'm better off alone. I don't get attached. I'm not that affected. Because in the empath's reflection, they see evidence to the contrary. They see their own tenderness. And tenderness is what they've worked hardest to hide. Often, avoidants suppress these parts of themselves for survival. Maybe expressing need was once met with rejection. Maybe vulnerability was dismissed or mocked. So they compartmentalized, they intellectualized feelings instead of feeling them. They built distance where closeness once hurt. The empath doesn't tear down those walls aggressively. Instead, they sit so steadily in emotional honesty that the walls begin to look unnecessary. The avoidant starts to feel things they thought they had outgrown. They feel protective, they feel attached, they feel seen in a way that makes performance impossible. The empath's authenticity acts as an invitation and a confrontation. It invites the avoidant to reconnect with their suppressed humanity, but it also confronts them with the reality that their defenses are visible. And for someone who values control, being emotionally read can feel like exposure without armor. There is also something else happening beneath the surface. The empath not only mirrors pain, they mirror potential. They reflect the avoidant's capacity for depth, for warmth, for devotion. They respond to the hidden softness rather than the guarded exterior. They treat the avoidant as if their vulnerable self is real and worthy. That can be both beautiful and terrifying. Because once someone responds to the real you, you can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. The suppressed parts, the longing for closeness, the desire to be chosen, the fear of loss, rise to the surface, and the avoidant must decide whether to integrate those parts or retreat back into suppression. The empath does not force that ice. They simply hold up the mirror long enough for the truth to be undeniable. And sometimes what people fear most is not rejection, but recognition. Being truly seen creates both longing and fear in someone who avoids intimacy. There is a profound difference between being liked and being known. Many people can handle admiration. They can handle attraction. They can even handle affection at a certain distance. But being known deeply, accurately, without distortion, is an entirely different experience. For someone who avoids intimacy, being truly seen awakens two powerful and conflicting forces at the same time. The first is longing. When someone understands you without constant explanation, it feels relieving. When they anticipate your moods, recognize your patterns, and accept your complexities, it touches something ancient inside you, the human need to belong without performance. The avoidant feels this. They may not say it out loud, but they feel the comfort of being understood without being chased. They feel the safety of someone who doesn't demand emotional theatrics, but quietly pays attention. They feel the warmth of someone who notices when they're overwhelmed and doesn't make it a spectacle. And in those moments, their guarded system softens. They lean in. They open up slightly more than they plan to. That is the longing bee. It whispers, "This feels good." It says, "Stay here." It says, "Maybe this time it's safe." But almost immediately, the second force appears, fear, because being seen means there is something to lose. When intimacy deepens, it creates emotional stakes. The connection is no longer casual. It is no longer disposable. And for someone who has built their life around minimizing vulnerability, emotional stakes feel dangerous. If this person knows me, they can hurt me. If this person matters to me, I can be abandoned. If I let his grow, I might not survive the loss. The more accurately someone sees them, the more exposed they feel. It's not exposure in a dramatic sense, it's subtle. It's the awareness that someone can detect when they're pretending. Someone can sense when they're scared. Someone can tell when they're withdrawing out of fear rather than logic. That awareness destabilizes their control. Avoidants often rely on emotional distance as a way to regulate themselves. Distance gives them power. It allows them to retreat before attachment becomes dependency. But when someone truly sees them, emotional distance becomes harder to maintain without being obvious. And that is frightening, because now the withdrawal isn't invisible. Now it has meaning. Now it can be questioned gently, and being questioned about emotions feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. One step deeper, and you're in territory you don't know how to navigate. Yet despite the fear, the longing doesn't disappear. In fact, it intensifies. They begin to replay conversations. They think about the way this person made them feel understood. They notice the absence when that presence isn't there. They experience moments of vulnerability, alone, and wish they could share them, but hesitate. This internal tug-of-war creates confusion. From the outside, it may look like inconsistency, hot and cold behavior, closeness followed by distance, but internally, it feels like survival battling desire. Desire says, open up. Survival says, protect yourself. And survival has had years of practice. Being truly seen forces an avoidant to confront a choice. Remain safe in isolation or risk the discomfort of intimacy. The tragedy is that intimacy is exactly what they crave, but only if it doesn't threaten their autonomy or reopen old wounds. So they hover at the edge, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to avoid the burn. And the reason they never forget the one who truly saw them is because that person awakened both forces so clearly. They reminded them of what connection feels like, and simultaneously revealed how unprepared they feel to sustain it. Fear without longing would lead to indifference, but when both exist together, the experience becomes unforgettable, a haunting reminder of what is possible and what still feels unsafe. The empath's calm presence dismantles emotional walls without force. There is a unique kind of power in calmness, not passivity, not weakness, but grounded, regulated emotional steadiness. The empath doesn't arrive with demands or ultimatums. They don't try to break down defenses with confrontation or pressure. Instead, they bring consistency, and consistency is disarming to someone who is used to chaos or emotional unpredictability. Avoidants often built their walls in response to instability. Maybe emotions in their past felt overwhelming, explosive, or unsafe. So they learned to shut down instead of lean in. They learned to detach instead of depend. Their walls are not random, they are engineered for protection. Most people respond to those walls with frustration. They push harder, they ask for reassurance repeatedly. They interpret distance as rejection and react emotionally. That reaction confirms the avoidant's deepest fear. Closeness leads to overwhelm, but the empath does something different. When the avoidant pulls back, the empath doesn't panic. They notice it, but they don't chase it. When communication slows, they don't spiral into accusation. When vulnerability appears and then retreats, they don't mock or shame it. They remain steady. That steadiness creates safety. Because what the avoidant expects is intensity, they expect neediness, they expect emotional escalation. Instead, the insteaded encounter patience. They encounter someone who can hold space without demanding immediate access. Calm presence quietly says, you can open at your pace. It says, I am not here to invade you. It says, I can handle my emotions, so you don't have to manage them for me. For someone who avoids intimacy, this is new territory. They are accustomed to either being chased or being left abruptly. They are not used to someone who can stand firm without force. And here is the subtle transformation. The walls begin to feel unnecessary. Walls are built to keep danger out. But when no danger presents itself, maintaining those walls becomes exhausting. The empath's consistency creates a contradiction in the avoidance belief system. If closeness equals chaos, why does this feel calm? If vulnerability equals pressure, why does this feel spacious, Jie? The empath doesn't dismantle defenses with arguments. They dismantle them with reliability. They show up when they say they will. They communicate directly instead of indirectly. They express needs without blame. This regulated energy signals emotional maturity, and emotional maturity reduces threat. Over time, the avoidant may find themselves sharing something personal without planning to. They may open up about a past experience. They may admit a fear in a fleeting moment. And instead of that confession being met with drama, it is met with acceptance. No interrogation, no emotional explosion, just understanding. That experience challenges their internal script because vulnerability did not lead to humiliation. Openness did not lead to chaos. Emotion did not lead to loss of control. The empath's calmness is not accidental. It often comes from self-awareness. They know their worth. They know they cannot force someone to be ready. So they refuse to abandon themselves in order to access someone else. That refusal is powerful. It creates an environment where intimacy is invited, not extracted. And here is the paradox. The less the empath tries to tear down the wall, the more it lowers naturally. Pressure reinforces resistance, but safety reduces the need for resistance. The avoidant may not see, unconsciously recognize what is happening. They may simply notice that this connection feels different, less draining, less chaotic, more grounding, and that grounded feeling can be both comforting and destabilizing. Comforting because it feels secure, destabilizing because it contradicts their belief that deep connection is inherently unsafe. The empath doesn't conquer the wall, they outgrow it. And when someone experiences that kind of steady presence, it leaves a lasting imprint. Because once you've encountered intimacy that feels calm instead of consuming, it becomes harder to justify running from it. Even if fear still whispers to retreat, avoidants remember those who triggered growth, even if they ran from it. Growth is rarely comfortable. It stretches identity. It challenges long-held beliefs. It exposes blind spots we've carefully protected. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, growth often feels like a threat to the very structure that has kept them emotionally safe. Most connections don't demand growth. Many relationships allow people to stay exactly as they are. Surface-level dynamics require no deep self-examination. Casual attachments don't force you to confront your patterns. You can participate halfway, remain guarded, and still maintain the connection. But when someone enters your life and gently reveals your defenses, something shifts. The empath doesn't aggressively critique the avoidant. They don't issue ultimatums about personality traits. Instead, they embody emotional availability so consistently that it highlights the contrast. They communicate openly, express needs clearly, and take responsibility for their feelings. In doing so, they illuminate what healthy intimacy looks like. That illumination triggers awareness. Suddenly, the avoidant becomes conscious of their distancing habits. They notice when they deflect with humor. They notice when they withdraw instead of communicating discomfort. They notice how quickly they assume closeness will lead to suffocation. This awareness is uncomfortable. Before this connection, those behaviors felt automatic and justified. Now they feel visible. Now they feel like choices. And recognizing a pattern means recognizing responsibility. Growth always begins with awareness, but awareness is destabilizing when you're not ready to change. So sometimes the avoidant runs, not because the connection lacked depth, not because the feelings were weak, but because staying would require transformation. Staying would mean confronting fears they have avoided for years. Staying would mean risking vulnerability in a way that feels foreign. Leaving feels easier than evolving. Yet here's the truth about growth-triggering connections. They linger. They may distract themselves with work, new relationships, independence. But the memory of that connection carries something different. It carries the version of themselves they briefly glimpsed. They remember moments when they almost opened fully. Moments when they felt safe enough to be softer. Moments when they were challenged in a way that felt respectful rather than attacking. That kind of growth invitation is rare. It's easy to forget someone who simply adored you. It's easy to forget someone who made no demands on your emotional development. But it's difficult to forget someone who expanded your self-awareness, because once you've seen your own patterns clearly, you can't completely unsee them. The empath becomes associated with awakening, awakening to your fear of dependence, awakening to your desire for intimacy, awakening to the gap between who you are and who could become. Even if the avoidant rejects the opportunity in the moment, the seed has been planted. In future relationships, they may notice themselves pulling away and hear an echo of that empath's calm voice. They may recognize the cycle repeating. They may begin to question whether distance is truly protection or just habit. Growth doesn't always happen during the relationship. Sometimes it happens because of it. The person who triggered growth becomes unforgettable because they marked a turning point. They disrupted autopilot. They introduced emotional accountability without shame. And even if the avoidant chose familiarity over transformation at the time, they carry the awareness forward. Running can create physical distance, but it doesn't erase internal realization. And deep down, they know the truth. The connection didn't fail because it lacked compatibility. It faltered because growth requires courage. And courage is frightening when you've built your identity around control. The ones who trigger growth are not always the ones we keep, but they are often the ones we remember when we're finally ready to become more. The one who didn't chase becomes unforgettable because they embodied self-worth. In many relational dynamics, especially when one person leans avoidant, there's an unspoken pattern that plays out. Distance creates pursuit. The more one pulls back, the more the other leans in. The more unavailable someone becomes, the more valuable they appear. It's a dance fueled by anxiety and validation. But when that pattern doesn't happen, when the person on the other side refuses to chase, everything changes. The empath who embodies self-worth does not interpret distance as a call to prove themselves. They don't see withdrawal as a challenge to overcome. They see it as information. And instead of responding with desperation, they respond with dignity. That response is powerful because the avoidant is often accustomed to being pursued. They expect their silence to trigger texts. They expect their emotional unavailability to spark reassurance seeking. They expect someone to work harder the moment they create space. When that doesn't happen, it disrupts the pattern. The empath may express interest openly. They may communicate feelings clearly, but they do not beg for reciprocation. They do not shrink their needs to maintain access. They do not overextend themselves to compensate for inconsistency. They stand still, and standing still requires immense inner strength. Self-worth says, I desire you, but I do not need to convince you. It says, I am open, but I am not available for half love. It says, if you step back, I will not chase, I will observe. This grounded energy creates a mirror of a different kind. It reflects to the avoidant that connection is a choice, not a game. That love is mutual, not earned through pursuit. That emotional availability cannot be extracted by pressure. For someone used to dynamics where distance equals power, encountering someone who remains steady without chasing feels unfamiliar. It removes the ego boost of being sought after. It removes the reassurance that someone will always compensate for their withdrawal. It removes the illusion of control, and in that removal, something deeper surfaces: respect. Even if the avoidant doesn't consciously articulate it, they feel the shift. They sense that this person values themselves too much to beg. They recognize that this presence is not rooted in dependency, but in choice. Choice is powerful because it implies freedom. The empath who doesn't chase is choosing to stay when connection is mutual and choosing to leave when it is not. That clarity is magnetic. It communicates emotional maturity without speeches or ultimatums. And when the empath eventually walks away, calmly, without dramatic retaliation, it lands differently. No explosion to justify the avoidance withdrawal. No emotional chaos to validate their fear of intimacy. Just quiet departure grounded in self-respect. That quiet departure lingers because it forces reflection. They begin to realize that the person who didn't chase wasn't indifferent. They were secure. They weren't detached. They were disciplined. They weren't playing hard to get. They simply refuse to abandon themselves. And self-abandonment is often what fuels chasing. When someone refuses to sacrifice their standards for proximity, it highlights the imbalance that existed. It reveals that love was offered freely, but not at the cost of dignity. That kind of presence is rare. It's easy to forget someone who constantly pursued. It's harder to forget someone who stood firm. The one who didn't chase becomes unforgettable because they embodied what healthy love looks like. Desire without desperation, openness without overextension, affection without self-erasure. They leave behind more than memories. They leave behind a standard. And once someone has experienced a connection where self-worth was modeled so clearly, every future dynamic feels different in comparison. When an empath walks away, they leave behind a reflection the avoidant cannot unsee. There is something profoundly different about being left by someone who still cared. Not someone who exploded in anger, not someone who withdrew coldly, but someone who remained loving and chose themselves anyway. When the empath walks away, it is rarely impulsive. It is not a dramatic exit designed to punish. It is often a quiet decision made after deep patience, repeated understanding, and honest attempts at connection. And that quiet decision carries weight because it communicates something unmistakable. I saw the potential here. I felt the depth, but I will not stay where I am not met. For the avoidant, that departure doesn't immediately register as loss in the traditional sense. At first, there may even be relief from emotional intensity, relief from vulnerability, relief from the subtle pressure of being understood too well. But relief fades, and what remains is reflection. When the empath was present, they consistently mirrored the avoidant's deeper self, not just their guarded exterior. They responded to their hidden warmth. They acknowledged their fears without shaming them. They treated their potential as real. When that presence disappears, so does the mirror, and suddenly the avoidant is left alone with the image that was reflected back to them. They remember the conversations where they almost opened fully. They remember moments where they felt seen beyond their defenses. They remember the steadiness that didn't react to their distance with panic. Most of all, they remember how it felt to be understood without being chased. That memory becomes difficult to erase, because once someone has shown you who you are beneath your armor, it becomes harder to hide from yourself. You may attempt distraction. You may rationalize the breakup. You may tell yourself it simply wasn't right. But deep down, you know something else was happening. You were being invited into growth. The empath's departure creates a silence that amplifies awareness. There is no longer someone gently calling out the withdrawal. No one softly asking what's really going on beneath the surface. No one modeling emotional clarity in real time. And in that silence, patterns become louder. The avoidant may notice themselves repeating the same distancing behaviors in future connections. They may encounter partners who don't see through their defenses and realize how different that feels. They may even long for the depth they once had, only to recognize that Empath required vulnerability they weren't ready to sustain. The reflection becomes permanent. It is not just a memory of a person. It is a memory of who they were allowed to be in that person's presence. Softer, more open, more emotionally honest than they usually permitted themselves to be. That version of themselves lingers like a ghost of possibility. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Losing someone who saw your highest self can create a deeper ache than losing someone who only saw your surface, because it confronts you with what you stepped away from. The empath doesn't leave chaos behind. They leave clarity. They leave an example of love that was steady, self-respecting, and emotionally available. They leave proof that connection does not have to be dramatic to be profound. That proof challenges old beliefs. If intimacy felt safe once, perhaps it can again. If vulnerability didn't destroy them before, perhaps it won't next time. If someone saw their depth and stayed, perhaps they are worthy of being fully known. The avoidant cannot unsee the reflection because it was not imposed. It was revealed. And once revealed, truth has a way of echoing long after the person who revealed it is gone. The empath walks away with their self-worth intact. The avoidant walks away with a mirror embedded in memory. Thank you for your time and trust. Your presence made this conversation meaningful. wishing you clarity and courage on your journey ahead. Goodbye and take care.